Hello, friends. My name is Ty, and I'm going to read to you. Seeing that it's October and spooky season is upon us, I decided I'm going to read a ghost story tonight. Tonight's selection is called The Important Thing. It was published a number of years ago in an anthology called Nefarious North, edited by Paul Archer, and it was a lot of fun to write. Here we go. The most important thing, the sergeant in front of me said, is to keep the rats from eating her. What? I asked as I stopped and looked at him. The embankment beneath my boots was slick with mud from the constant rain, and I was trying to stay upright in the dark as I followed him down the narrow footpath towards our destination. My attention was focused on the ground, to lessen the likelihood I'd fall on my ass and soil my already soaked uniform, and I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. What did you say? The rats, he said over his shoulder as he negotiated the trail. They keep trying to eat the body, and the homicide guys are all bent out of shape about it. The smell of charred meat was thick in the air. We reached the floor of the gully we'd been sliding into, and our footpath carried on into the trees. I followed the sergeant through the dark and arrived in a small clearing only a few paces from one side to the other. Opposite where I stood was a tarp set up on tent poles, guarded by another shivering cop, his face pale and slack from a night of standing in the rain. The greasy, charred smell was doubly thick in the clearing, and I felt my stomach twist in a decidedly aggressive manner. Your relief is here, the sergeant said cheerfully, and clapped the shivering cop on the shoulder. The drenched man nodded to me. If you shine your light on them, they get scared and run into the bush, he said. What gets scared? The rats. Big fuckers. Great, I said, that charred smell working its way further into my head. I'll leave you to it, the sergeant said, keeping his back to the clearing and not getting any closer to the strung up tarp than he had to. He slapped my back and took off the way he'd come, nearly running up the trail in his haste to get away. The shivering cop dug into his pockets and passed me 2 hand warmers. You'll need these, he said. And don't forget your flashlight. He turned down the trail, his shape disappearing in the dark, and I was quickly very much alone. The tall, moss-covered trees bore silent witness to my discomfort as I carefully avoided looking at the twisted, blackened shape beneath the roof of the tarp. I shifted my feet, the mud making sucking noises around my boots, as I tried to ignore the smell of the body that was still quietly steaming in the cool air. There was no sound to penetrate the deep silence of the early morning October. There was no breeze to disturb the trees, and the closest houses were too far away for the sound or light, for their life to reach this dead, blackened spot. As I stood in the wet dark, waiting for it to get light enough for the forensic crew to return and start working, I heard a faint whisper behind me. I turned, a hot bloom spreading through my chest as I looked at the body. Its jaw was moving slightly as it whispered, too quietly for me to hear. I had no interest in hearing what it had to say, of course, and I took 2 shuffling side steps preparing to flee down the footpath. In those 2 steps, reason returned, and I realized the blackened corpse was not speaking, but being snacked upon by a rodent large enough to do a reasonable impression of a small dog. I drew the flashlight from the steel ring on my belt and flicked it on, and the bright LED light hammered through the dark, throwing up hunched, glowering shadows. I saw 2 glowing orbs in the hard circle of light, and they regarded me for the space of a heartbeat before they turned and flitted into the underbrush. I swept the beam of light back and forth, chasing away 2 other pairs of eyes, and let them rest on my steaming ward. Despite my resolution to avoid looking at the body, I could not pull my eyes away and found myself taking a good, long look. If you didn't know what it was, you'd have to study it for a while before it occurred to you. The limbs were so shriveled and blackened they no longer resembled anything human, and the oddly white teeth leering out of a blackened, twisted skull gave the only significant clue to what it was. The small body, curled in on itself, was originally thought to be a child. It was not until the forensic team found the underwire of a bra seared into the corpse's flesh that they determined it was a woman. I looked back up at the trees and thought the small clearing would be a lonely place to die. Then I looked at the body and hoped that she was already dead when whoever dumped her here had set her on fire. The next 2 hours were spent pulling my boots from the sucking mud and chasing the rats away from my grim-faced companion. Eventually, the forensic team showed up, and I was allowed to sneak away periodically to eat and answer nature's call. The forensic people, 3 cops in blue jumpsuits, went over every inch of the scene. They put small items into what looked like jewelry boxes and bigger items into paper bags, all the while making copious amounts of notes in large black notebooks. The rats weren't inclined to get too close with so many people there, and my job shifted to keeping the 2-legged rats out of the scene instead of the 4. During the day, my eyes were pulled back again and again to the horribly white teeth and the blackened orb of the body's head. It was the only thing I could see that evidenced her humanity, and that was the thing that terrified and fascinated me most. The day wore on and night began to fall, the darkness coming all the more quickly under the cover of the trees and a cloudy sky. Just as it got too dark to work, the forensic team lifted my grinning friend from the ground and put her in a white body bag. "We need to hold the scene a while longer," the head of the forensic team, a middle-aged sergeant with a neat mustache, told me. "We still have to process the ground she was laying on." He looked at his watch. "It'll be a couple hours till relief gets here. You gonna be all right?" I nodded and rubbed a damp hand across my face. "Yeah, I'm already as wet as I'm gonna get. A couple more hours won't hurt." Very quickly they were gone, and I was alone in the dark, again, with only the trees for company. I checked my watch every 3 or 4 minutes, waiting for my relief, dreaming of a hot shower to wash away the stink and a few cold beers. Suddenly, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye and turned back to where the body had been. Standing beside the tarp, looking down at the spot, was a pale young woman in a short black skirt and white tank top. I had no idea how she'd gotten past me, but hot anger made my heart spike, both at the fact I'd seen her and that she was pissing about in my crime scene and making me look like a stooge. "What the fuck are you doing?" I shouted as I shined my flash on her. "Get away from there. This is a crime scene." The young woman pushed her lank hair back over her ear and turned away from the sagging tarp to face me. She folded her arms like she was cold, but made no other movement, and only stood, staring at the ground near my feet with pale gray eyes. "Are you fucking stupid?" I asked, squelching through the mud towards her. "Get away from there." Still, she didn't move, even when I was within arm's reach of her. It was then I realized she was standing in the pouring rain, but was not wet. An awful feeling, like a rough, cold hand, gripped the base of my neck, and I took a step backwards. The girl turned her gray eyes down further and pointed at the spot where the body had been. As her arm and finger extended, she flickered, like the picture on an old television, and in that shift she turned from a still, placid figure into a burning conflagration, her mouth locked open in a silent scream. The shift was over in a moment, so quick I wasn't sure I'd seen it, but the image of her bare, scorched scalp and blistered skin couldn't be shaken away. I opened my eyes and looked at the girl again. She was still pointing to where the body had been, and was staring at my boots, unblinking, unmoving. There was no menace about her, but the sight of her burning figure still flickered as after images in my vision, and I felt the muscles of my legs and back shake and rebel as I tried to move towards her. I managed to seize hold of my own body and took 3 small, shaky steps forward. Her eyes never left my boots, and her hand didn't waver. "Was that you?" I asked, my voice sounding thin and mewling in my own ears. The girl, or what had once been a girl, I suppose, nodded once, her chin moving up and down slowly. She hadn't lowered her arm and still pointed towards the ground where the body, her body, had been. I took another short, quaking step forward, trying to divide my attention between the silent girl and the spot she was pointing to. I kept waiting for her flicker again, or for her to reach out one of her pale hands and latch onto me, but she didn't move and only kept pointing. I followed the direction of her finger and saw a broad, flat log, the end of it just visible beneath the spread of the bramble bushes that ringed the clearing. It was almost full dark again, and I couldn't make out what she wanted me to see. I moved the flashlight from her face and shone the beam on the log. My stomach flipped again as I finally saw what she was pointing at. Several long scratches and 2 broken fingernails marred the surface of the wood. You were alive when you burned, I said, turning from the log to face her again. She nodded again, just once, and lowered her arm. I rubbed a hand across my eyes, suddenly convinced that this must all be a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. If I rubbed hard enough, I thought, I could wipe the image of this pale girl from my sight and the world would go back to normal. But when I opened my eyes again, she was still there. What do you want? I asked, dropping my hand from my face. Why are you here? She turned and walked towards the edge of the clearing. As she stepped, she flickered again, her long hair and clothing replaced by a charred scalp and scorched rags hanging from a twisted body. At the edge of the clearing, she stopped and looked back, her gray eyes visible over her bony shoulder. I stood on the opposite side of the clearing, near where her body had been, my boots steadily sinking into the muck as I watched her. The logical part of my brain was yelling at me to run, like my ass was on fire, and the other part, the part that feels, told me there was no need to run, that this girl was not going to hurt me. The look on her pale face was expectant, and the feeling part of my brain wanted to know what she expected of me. There was a crashing and cursing behind me, and the grinning sergeant who met me in the morning appeared, leading another vaguely dry, uniformed cop. Your relief is here, the sergeant said happily, as he walked into the clearing and clapped me on the shoulder. Now that the body was gone, his discomfort was gone as well, and I had a distinct urge to punch him in the tender spot right below his nose. I looked back to where the girl was standing, but she was gone, leaving nothing to indicate she was ever there, nothing except for the burned spot on the ground and the broken fingernails. You don't need to worry about the rats anymore, I said to the already shivering cop who replaced me, and walked up the trail and back to my patrol car. An hour later, I was showered and in dry clothes, walking out of the precinct office and heading for my car. I was beginning to think the pale girl in the tank top was nothing more than a hallucination, brought on by near hypothermia and exhaustion. I dropped my sodden uniform in the trunk of my car with a wet plop, then slipped into the driver's seat and leaned forward to put the key in the ignition, and promptly started screaming. In the passenger seat of my car sat the pale girl. I got just the barest whiff of charred meat as she turned and looked at me, her eyes focused on my chest. And as she moved, she flickered again, transforming into the burning figure. The change was over in a heartbeat, and the pale girl once again sat in my car, watching me with sad gray eyes. What the fuck do you want from me? I yelled, panic making my voice rise in both pitch and volume. The girl didn't speak, but turned her head, and looked at the driveway leading out of the office parking lot. She looked back at me, her eyes still on my chest, with that awful flicker once more, then turned her eyes back to the driveway. You want me to go that way? I asked. There was no response, but she kept staring at the driveway. I tapped my fingers on the gear shift of my car as the feeling part of my brain tapped the backs of my eyes, trying to get my attention, and forced me to make a decision. I studied the back of the pale girl's head and the uneven part of her hair, as several tumblers in my brain clicked into place. The important thing, right then, was to see what my passenger wanted me to do. I started my car and pulled from the parking lot, following the direction of her gaze. As I pulled onto the public street, she turned her head and looked left, and I turned the car to match her eyes. She never spoke, or pointed, or gave me any indication where we might be going. She just kept staring where she needed me to go, and I obliged her. We traveled from the city center, where the police station sat, and headed north, back to where her body had been. We passed through residential neighborhoods, both good and bad, guided by the turning of her head. As we neared the place where she'd lain and I had watched over her body, she flickered into the burning figure and stayed that way for several heartbeats. The smell of burning flesh had an intense, awful heat, filled my car, and it took every ounce of will I could muster not to dive from my vehicle and flee while I let it drift into a ditch. Once we passed the place of her death, the image stilled, returning to the placid, sad-looking girl. But the sight of her burning corpse, the flesh sloughing away in sheets as it blackened and seared, would not fade from my vision, and my stomach lurched in rebellion. The further we went, the more ramshackle the houses became. The yards grew narrower, and the houses began to sag as the property values dropped and the crime rate climbed. I'd been in this neighborhood many times while I was working, but never on my own time, and it was strangely uncomfortable, my morose companion notwithstanding. The girl looked down a narrow street, flickered once, and disappeared from my car. Her vanishing was as startling as her appearance, and I looked around in alarm for a moment, wondering where she'd gone. I saw her a moment later, a slight, washed-out, ghostly pale figure standing against the stained stucco of an old single-story house. I drove past the house and parked my car on the side of the road, then got out and carefully walked back towards the old dwelling. The girl was still standing where I'd seen her, looking at the front door of the house, but when I started walking up the driveway, she turned and watched me, her eyes on my feet. There was a beat-up old Chevy pickup in the carport beside the house, the dented cargo box filled with articles of trash. As I got closer, the sad eyes left me and shifted to the box and the heaps of garbage. I stopped and followed her eyes, which were focused on a small, black purse. I reached down and picked up the shiny vinyl object and looked inside. There was a wallet containing a cracked driver's license, and I held the plastic card up to the light and looked from the small picture to the girl in front of me. It was her. "Your name was Vanessa," I said, lowering the driver's license. It felt odd to be talking about her in the past tense when she was right in front of me, but the sad creature was a faded reflection of the pretty girl in the driver's license. She was still staring at the bed of the truck, and I turned again. I had to look longer this time, but eventually found what she wanted me to see. A small red jerry can, the lid discarded. "Holy fuck," I muttered, looking at the jerry can and gripping the driver's license. A shout from inside the house startled me and I crouched, my heart slapping up against the inside of my ribcage while I put my hand on the butt of the pistol I had concealed under my coat. I took several quick steps and pressed myself against the corner of the house near the broken front window that was held together with duct tape and plastic sheeting. "Quit your fucking crying," a rough, tobacco-cured voice said from inside the house. "I got no time for it." "But what if we get caught, man? I told you we shouldn't have done it." A second voice, higher than the first, had a note of panic in it. "You weren't fucking complaining yesterday when you had her bent over in that field." I glanced over at the girl, who was still standing in the driveway near the back end of the pickup. She was looking at the house mildly, her lank hair framing her sad face. She said nothing, made no movement, but every time the rough voice burst through the thin window, her visage flickered. The shift kept up, quick as a strobe light, until I felt ill looking at her. "I didn't know any better," the second voice wailed. "I was drunk. I didn't want to kill her." "No," the first voice said, in reasonable agreement. "You didn't want to. You wanted me to do it. When she started screaming, telling you to stop, saying she was going to call the cops, you told me to shut her up." There was a pause, and I heard the faint flick of a lighter and an exaggerated inhaling. "You wanted me to shut her up, and I did, so stop your fucking crying." "It wasn't even my idea. You were the one who grabbed her and shoved her in the truck. That was all you." "You've been fucking complaining all night how bad you needed to get laid. So I got you laid." "You know that's not what I meant." "Once again," the first voice said, the rough tones nearly a purr. "You weren't complaining when your dick was getting wet." The second voice tried to speak several times, but each time his words were cut off with a heavy sob. "But you burned her, man," the voice finally gagged out. "She was still alive. I could still hear her screaming." "Look, shut the fuck up, you fucking pussy. You want to go to jail? I been, and I ain't going back. You ever heard of DNA? Well, it was all over that bitch, yours and mine. I had to sort that shit out. You had problems. I fixed them. Don't whine about it now that the job's done. We ain't gonna get caught, so you ain't gotta worry. Now have a beer and shut up. You're giving me a fucking headache." The greasy weight of the words crawled through my ears and settled in my gut, making it flip over while my knees turned watery. I watched the girl while the voices inside spoke. With every word and every burning flicker, her color faded a little more, and her shoulders slumped further forward, as though each syllable was a memory of her last few tortured moments, and they dragged the last vestiges of life from her. I did not know the girl in front of me, but I could see that she'd been failed. She'd been failed by whatever family she had, who let her wander the dark streets of the worst part of a bad city at night. She'd been failed by a society who allowed boogeymen, like the ones inside, to walk free and snatch children off the street. and she would likely be failed by a system that would not hold to account monsters who raped her and then set her on fire to hide their crime. But she would not be failed by me. Not today, anyway. I drew my pistol from its holster and crouched as I crept around towards the window on the front door. I knew the body of the girl was burnt badly enough, right down to the bone, that it would be almost impossible for their forensic guys to get any evidence. If I didn't lay hands on these two assholes, after finding the driver's license and knowing what I did, they'd never be caught. Explaining to a judge that I was led to a plethora of evidence by a ghost that sometimes looked like it was burning was going to be problematic, and I would have to do the best I could with what I had. I stood square in front of the door and held my pistol up at eye level. I glanced behind me at the girl. For the first time since I'd seen her, she was looking into my eyes, and her image was steady, her face clear. She nodded once, her chin moving up and down, and then was still. I turned back to the door, took a deep breath, and kicked it in. A file folder plopped on the desk in front of me, and I turned from my computer screen to look up at my boss, who stood beside my desk with a coffee cup in his hand. "Did you see the briefing notes?" he asked. I looked down, and then back up at him. "Well, I have now." "That scene with the burned-up body from a couple weeks ago. The homicide guys figure they know who did it." "Oh yeah?" I asked, sitting back in my seat and folding my hands over behind my head. "Do they need uniform to go bring the guys in?" My boss shook his head. "Nope. Looks like the guys are dead. Uniformed guys in the Northern District got a call of a strange smell coming from a house and went in to check. Found 2 rotting bodies. Looks like they were beat to death. But they also found ID from the girl who got burned up, plus a pair of her underwear with her DNA on it, in the glove box of the pickup in the driveway." "Oh, wow," I said. "Neighbors from across the street said the 2 guys were assholes. It didn't seem torn up they were dead. But they also said they saw a guy in the driveway, day after the body was located, who kicked in the door and went inside with a gun in his hand. They say that guy looked like he knew what he was doing, and didn't call it in because I thought it was probably a cop who was there to bust the 2 guys on something." "Oh," I said. "They get a description?" "Yep," my boss said, looking me up and down. "You have any idea what the guy might look like?" "You haven't given me the description yet, so no." "They said he was about 6'2", big guy, driving a blue sports car." "It's a big city, boss. That doesn't really narrow it down." "What color is your car?" "Blue," I said. "Uh-huh. Is there anything you want to tell me?" "Not a thing," I said, meeting his gaze evenly. "Okay then, that's what I thought." He picked up the file folder from my desk and started walking across the big room to his office. He stopped and turned back to me and took a slurp of coffee. "I told the homicide guys that I didn't know anyone who matched their description, but you'll let me know if you think of anything, though, won't you?" "I think the important thing here, boss," I said as I turned back to my computer, "is to know those 2 motherfuckers won't be setting any more teenagers on fire." I began typing, not looking up, letting my boss's eyes linger on the side of my head. He took another slurp of coffee and turned away. I often wonder if he knew or was only guessing. Either way, he never mentioned it again. I have seen the girl only once since the day she guided me to her murderers. I attended her funeral with the other cops who worked on her homicide and saw her walking among the grave markers, her image steady, the tortured figure gone, and I caught the faint scent of vanilla soap instead of charred flesh. I do not feel guilty for what I've done, and I tell myself the important thing is that sometimes vengeance brings us peace. For some of us, anyway. Thanks very much for being here with me, my friends. Until next time.